This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share. Thank you for joining us on America's Roundtable, a weekly program from Washington, D.C., with leaders from business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I am your co-host, Joel Anand-Sami, joined by Natasha Srdoc, co-founder of the International Leaders Summit and former contributor to the Economist Intelligence Unit. We are truly pleased to be joined by the Honorable Maurice McTigue, who is the Vice President at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He is the Director of the Mercatus Center's Government Accountability Project and a member of its Spending and Budget Initiative and State and Local Policy Project. He joined the Mercatus Center at George Mason University in 1997, where he advised the Office of Management and Budget and most several agencies in the Clinton and Bush administrations. He has consulted with legislators and governors in over 20 states. We are truly delighted to have you join us this morning.
Good morning, Maurice.
Morning, Natasha and Joel. I'm happy to be here.
The U.S. budget deficit reached almost $1 trillion in July and is projected to climb up to $1.3 trillion in this fiscal year ending in September 30th, which is 8.5% of the nation's gross domestic product. And this will be above the $1 trillion mark for a fourth straight year. President Obama's announced budget plan this Monday is to slash the budget deficit to below 3% of the GDP by the end of the decade. And the proposed way to do it is by imposing taxes on the rich, as he says, and wealthy, and by increasing infrastructure spending to boost job and economic growth. Mr. McTigue, you were a member of New Zealand's government that significantly reduced government spending and achieved a balanced budget that had been sustained for decades. How did you accomplish that? And what would be your advice to the U.S. legislators in their efforts to reduce government spending and move closer to the balanced budget?
Well, I think that the focus has to be on spending, not on taxing. It's interesting, if you do a long-run study of tax revenues in the United States, it doesn't matter what tax rate was imposed, the amount of money collected has for 75 years stayed around 19% of GDP. So taxing isn't going to work if you take a strict economic approach. So you have to concentrate on spending. But when you're going to concentrate on spending, and given the makeup of the federal government in the United States, you have to do it more quickly than people are proposing at the moment. We've looked at many countries, some of whom have been very successful at controlling budgets, and certainly New Zealand was one of the first to do that. After 23 years of deficits in the 1980s, it concentrated on starting to reform its government and then to eliminate its deficit. And it did that over a period of 4 years. From when we started on deficit reduction to eliminating the deficit, it took just under 4 years. And then there was 18 years of surpluses that followed that. If you look at Canada in the 1990s, Canada had a budget situation that didn't look too dissimilar to the United States now. And in 1993, a Liberal government in Canada started budget reductions, and they managed to go from an 8% of GDP deficit to budget balance in 4 years. So I think the end of the decade is too long. It enables the politicians to put off making decisions now to some later date. The urgency is to do it right now. And if you don't do that, then the government will continue to extract too much money out of the economy and won't leave enough money there for the private sector to create wealth and prosperity.
What is your opinion about how many years would be needed for United States to reach a balanced budget?
I would say that 4 to 5 fiscal periods would be the right period of time. The problem with even 5 years is that would be into a third electoral cycle for Congress, and being able to hold together a coalition that's committed to reducing spending and balancing the budget would be very difficult over 3 election periods.
Special interest lobbying many times stands in the way when it comes to cutting the government expenditures. And as we were celebrating Milton Friedman's centennial, he would have been 100 years old last week. I would like to just quote just briefly from his book Free to Choose, a passage where he says government budgets are determined by adding together expenditures that are authorized for a host of separate programs. The small number of people who have a special interest in each specific program spend money and work hard to get it passed. The large number of people, each of whom will be assessed a few dollars to pay for the program, will not find it worthwhile to spend money or work to oppose it, even if they manage to find out about it. The majority does rule, but it is a rather special kind of a majority. It consists of a coalition of special interest minorities.
Well, I think the first response to that is that Milton Friedman, of course, was right. The second response is that in the United States, lobbying has certainly been a growth industry over the last 2 decades. And it happens aggressively at a state level, but much more aggressively at a federal level. So if you look at that process of lobbying and you divide it into its component parts, there's the asking, and the right to ask is protected by free speech and the Constitution, and it's okay to ask. So what you really have to concentrate on then is the giving or the granting of the request, the favor, the preference, or the privilege. And there, I believe that the procedures of legislatures have made it easier for the giver of preference to be able to do that. And it's because more and more the legislature has allowed omnibus legislation that puts many different ideas or decisions together, and they're decided on one vote. So congressmen are not going to want to vote against funding for troops overseas. But if you put in there tax concessions and a whole lot of preference and privileges as well, those congressmen are going to vote for funding of the troops overseas, but at the same time would pass those other requests. My solution is don't let that happen. Ban omnibus legislation, ban any amendments to bills unless they're germane to the subject of that bill. Because most of those requests would not get approval by Congress if they had to stand up on their own as a one-only request. For example, the historic legislation that created Obamacare had 1,500 to 1,800 pages, many of which were not about health care at all, but all sorts of preferences that were being granted to make a particular member of Congress vote for the primary legislation. In my book of values, that's not right. It seems like a form of bribery.
Right. And I remember as you were speaking at our International Leaders Summit in Brussels, actually, it was in the European Parliament when we addressed the political corruption in general in different parts of the world. And as one of the panelists mentioned the corruption that may be happening in the halls of Congress, you actually put an analogy whereby something similar happening in New Zealand, people would end up in jail. Could you kindly address that? That would be great to hear.
Well, of course, there's a difference between exercising your right to ask for favors and offering inducements or bribes. And from time to time, members of Congress do indeed finish up in jail for doing just exactly that, accepting bribes. So there are laws there that protect against that. Different countries have different sets of values, and the Supreme Court of the United States has held that the right to the freedom of speech also includes the right to be able to make donations to people's campaigns, but the proximity of those donations to campaigns and the granting of a request is something that looks suspicious, and from time to time I think contributes significantly to the public's distrust of Congress and the institution of Congress itself. That needs to be fixed, and if it was more open and transparent, then I think much of that suspicion would disappear.
Thank you for joining us on America's Roundtable. We are delighted to have with us our guest host, Honorable Maurice McTigue. For those that have just tuned in at this moment, Maurice McTigue is a seasoned expert on government reform and brings practical experience and scholarly research to the table from his distinguished career as a former cabinet minister and a member of parliament in his native New Zealand. Holding 7 different ministerial portfolios during his 9 years in the New Zealand Parliament, McTigue was one of the architects of the New Zealand miracle. Mr. McTigue, you've also been very much involved with the various states here in the United States, working with, for example, as an advisor to Louisiana's Commission on Streamlining Government, and also you were named to Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell's Commission on Government Reform and Restructuring. When we look at some of the states in the U.S. And comparing it to where the federal government is leading us to, what are some of the states that you have noticed which are doing the right thing?
I think that the states that are doing the right thing are the states that clearly have strong leadership with a commitment to responsible government. And you can't be a responsible government if you're irresponsible fiscally.
Indeed.
So there are now some surprising candidates in that list. I think that the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, is one of the people who is making a big difference in his state. But New Jersey has a long way to go before it gets its fiscal house properly in order. But the fact that somebody, A, campaigned on doing just that in New Jersey, B, got elected, and C, has very high recognition and standing in his state for doing things that people in New Jersey in the past would have said were politically suicidal. So I think that's good. There's a mood out there among the public that says we will go along with leaders who are leading us somewhere that we think is the right place to go. In other places, it's been leadership again, but also a willingness to take a critical look at where government spends its money. And in many instances, using things like restructuring commissions or commissions on spending are a good way to go about that, because it allows the identifying of options and it allows some public critique of those options before the politicians have to accept or reject them. But basically, getting budgets into fiscal balance again and responsible is not that difficult to do if you're thinking about it technically. What you need to do is eliminate low priorities. You need to eliminate poor performing activity. In other words, don't spend money on things that don't work. You need to get the government out of things that it shouldn't be involved in. You need to stop subsidizing activities because that's usually counterproductive. And you need to take a critical look at revenue spending. And revenue spending is where you give concessions to different businesses or individuals that minimizes their tax liability. And in many instances, that's grossly unfair to other businesses. And in many instances, states really go about trying to bribe new enterprises to come to their state by giving them major tax concessions. Look, the best economic development policy in the world is not to need one, because investors want to come to your particular state or country because it's a great place to invest. That's what they should be concentrating on. If you did those things, then the fiscal problems would disappear.
Mr. McTigue, in New Zealand, you canceled agricultural subsidies overnight. Canceling subsidies saved money twice, in direct prices as well as taxes that were used as subsidies. Could you share with listeners how did you accomplish that?
Well, I think for a start, you need to think about what a subsidy is. A subsidy is an inducement to do certain things, and by its definition, it's really asking you to do something that you wouldn't otherwise do without that payment of money. So it's designed to distort your decision making. That often means that what you're doing is that you are cutting out innovative or creative ways of doing your job better. It means that the particular business or the individual concentrates on earning the subsidy instead of looking at how we produce better products that are going to make consumers pay more for them. So in our experience, we just decided that subsidies were not good for the farming industry and that we needed to get out of them. And in my view, when you're going to attack a problem like this, you really have to look at, are you going to do it gradually? And if you choose that course, the probability is that you get stopped before you get it finished. Or are you going to do it suddenly? If you do it suddenly, the shock of that major loss is normally enough to make the industries think about how they will go about their business better. In summary, I would have to say that the best thing that's happened to New Zealand farming in the last 100 years was to take subsidies away. Our farmers are incredibly competitive worldwide. They are more profitable than ever before, and none of them would want to go back to subsidies.
We must also mention to our listeners, Mr. McTigue, that with your distinguished career in transforming New Zealand, you are certainly a farmer by trade and are speaking from experience rather than one communicating from a legislative body. And so, therefore, it is meaningful to hear your experiences of what transpired in New Zealand, where you and your colleagues proved that it could be done. And through that, truly created the New Zealand miracle.
Thank you. Well, governments can change the incentives and the structures, but you actually have to have people who are prepared to pick those new initiatives up and make them work. So in the end, taking the shackles away from enterprise and allowing it the freedom to grow in the way that it sees best is a really smart thing to do. So the compliments really have to go to the entrepreneurs who make it work. And what government has to do is realize that the shackles you're putting on business by putting in place all of these kind of mandates are really going to slow down your economy and slow down job creation, or in some cases eliminate it altogether and chase it to some other jurisdiction.
I would also like you to share with our listeners about results of your canceling the subsidies in agriculture arena. You mentioned about what happened to dairy products in New Zealand.
Yes, I think that this is sort of a little vignette that gives people an idea of what happened. In 1985, New Zealand farmers were getting about 45% of their income from the government in the form of subsidies, mainly price support payments. The dairy industry in 1985 was producing 35 products from milk. Last year, the dairy industry produced 2,200 products from milk without subsidies.
Wow.